Welcome to our February meeting for the Southern Piedmont Chapter of the North Carolina Native Plant Society. My name is Craig Maxwell, and I'm joined today by my co-chair, Laura Domingo. The North Carolina Native Plant Society's mission is to promote the enjoyment and conservation of North Carolina's native plants and their habitats through education, protection, propagation, and advocacy. The North Carolina Native Plant Society provides scholarships to university students, educational chapter meetings, guided field trips to rare locations, 4 newsletters each year, and native plant sales and auctions. You can become a member today at ncwildflower.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter. Today we're honored to have Dr. Larry Mellichamp here to speak with us about the Ericaceae family, better known as blueberries, azaleas, and rhododendrons. But first, he'll take us on a horticultural history lesson about how plants have become classified. Before retiring, Dr. Mellichamp was the Director of Botany and Horticulture at UNC Charlotte, as well as the Director of the UNC Charlotte Botanical Gardens. Thank you, Dr. Mellichamp. Take it away.
So this is a little timeline. This isn't going to take very long. You might find this something you haven't heard about much lately, but I'm going to take you on a timeline from 280 BC or BCE down through present day. And 280 BCE was the beginning, as far as we know, of what we call botany as a science or an endeavor. Wouldn't have even called it a science back then. The beginning of it was with Theophrastus over 2,000 years ago. Dioscorides in the year 70 CE, that would be AD, 70 Common Era. And then for the next 300 years, nothing. So all of this flurry of activity 2,000 years ago, and then nothing for 1,200 years. What happened in 300 that probably led to what we call the Dark Ages? They weren't as dark as we might have thought, but they're dark enough. No, the plague didn't come until 1,000 years later, into the 1300s. Fall of Rome. The fall of Rome took away all of the organization that had been built up in Europe by Alexander the Great and the Caesars and all of the Roman structure that allowed for things to happen in an organized way disappeared, and Europe fell into the Dark Ages. And then 1623, the next landmark, a botanist named Bauhin wrote a book that compiled all the known plants at his time, 1623. 1737, 100 years later, Carl Linnaeus began doing the same thing, compiling all of the known plants with a new system of classification and nomenclature. And his most famous date, 1753, when he wrote Species Plantarum, the book that is the beginning of our modern, if you will, our modern botany understanding of plant names. And then during the 1800s, various floras, things were disorganized. 1900, I'll show you what happened then. 2000, we won't talk about that very much, but things are getting even more refined. So here we go back. We're going to talk just a few seconds about each of these landmarks along this timeline. And believe me, this is a simplification. This would be like taking one book out of the UNCC library and saying, this is all I'm going to tell you about. There's a lot more details. In fact, Audrey will tell you, I was up into the wee hours. I found old literature that I hadn't seen, so I was sitting there reading about esoteric things well into the night. But Theophrastus, there he is. This is as good as I know what he looked like. He's the father of botany. I don't know who the mother of botany was, but he was the father of botany. So he was the first one to write about and describe plants. He used such categories as trees, shrubs, vines, herbs, bulbs. He recognized grasses. He recognized herbaceous plants and all the different ways that they grew. And he wrote all those down in his books. So he was the first one to understand, to compile, and to teach others about what he saw in nature.
Is he Roman?
Yes, he would have been, I think he was Greek. He was Greek. Well, the Romans hadn't come along yet. Wasn't long. In 70 CE was another major milestone. The Greek Dioscorides, that's the best we know what he looked like. He wrote a book that survived called Materia Medica. And it was a type of herbal. An herbal, you'll hear me talk about several times. An herbal is a book about herbs, about medicinal herbs. That's what people were worried about back then. They weren't worried about ornamental. They were worried about food, of course, but medicines, curing properties of plants, one of their main things. So his book was so important because he compiled all that was known about medicinal plants and other plants too, except everything had a medicinal use as far as he was concerned. He compiled all of that in 70 CE. And these are the illustrations that were used. You recognize any of these plants?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I do. You might recognize an arum, but I don't know what that is. And I don't know what that is. Lord, I don't know what that is. Here's a bulb of some kind. This is something in the carrot family. I have no idea what that is or that. So back then, they didn't do very good with their illustrations. They were very crude. In fact, often in the books that he wrote, he put little specimens of plants, a little dried plant specimen, a little simple or a sample of what the plant was that you would remember. So he would, because he made up all this stuff about the magic curative properties all these plants have. So here's what's surprising. Of all the books that were written early on, the one that survived through the Dark Ages was Dioscorides. We call it his Greek herbal, his Materia Medica. It's the one that survived, along with people would add new drawings, just as crude as the first ones. Look at these, they're practically scribbles. But here's a text of Dioscorides translated to some Persian language, Arabic, I guess. I don't not know my Persian languages. It'd be Farsi for all I know. But different languages all around Europe, such as they were. His text got copied and copied and copied and enhanced and elaborated with these crude drawings down through the ages. This didn't change until 1541, when a Dutch botanist named Fuchs, after whom our plant fuchsia was named, wrote his herbal and actually hired artists. Here two very obviously astute botanists who are illustrating plants from real life. And they created drawings that for the first time were recognizable. So this was a major new innovation in 1541. What do you suppose led to, there were many of these kinds of innovations, new drawings, more information, better information put into these books. What do you suppose? Two things happened that led to this, could have led to this innovation. Printing press for sure, 1450. The printing press, 1450. No, Reformation was much later. Nope. No, evolution wasn't known until 1850. No, the Renaissance started in 1365.
Exploration.
Give you one more guess.
Exploration of the New World.
Exploration of the New World. Columbus's discovery of the New World, this influx of new materials, especially plants. It's plants that were brought back. People were looking for new foods, new useful things, new medicines. So it was major influx. And the printing press allowed it to be compiled and disseminated through books. And so that led to the next wave of information. The landmark of this era was 1623, Castor Bauhin. after whom the tropical tree Bauhinia, butterfly, pea tree is named. And there he is, long beard. But he wrote this book. I translated all of this so I could read that to you, but that's the way they wrote. That's the title of the book right there. It's not only a title, that's the actual title, it's a description of what's in there. So he lays out illustrations and names of plants that were first brought to light by Theophrastus and Dioscorides 1,600 years earlier, and he compiles them for the first time, 6,000 known species in 1623. They hadn't yet realized how big the world was. So if you look in through here, you can read the text a little better. These are genera names. So what he is famous for is recognizing, before Dioscorides in his writing did not have the organization that was needed. So Bauhin brought an organization where he used genus names or generic names. Then these are the different species that he recognized in these genera. Even though they were poorly and crudely described, it was a beginning. This was the Encyclopedia Britannica of its day on plants, 1623. All the known plants and some better illustrations. The next landmark is this book, 1737, Hortus Cliffordianus. Hortus means it was a gardening, cultivated plants in the garden of Clifford, George Clifford, who was a wealthy British man who hired Linnaeus as his gardener in 1737. So imagine how much he learned. Now, Linnaeus was a very learned man. I don't know how many different languages he spoke, but he started as a gardener. And so that was great. So this was Linnaeus's first effort to put his new ideas and theories about plant names into practice. So his books were even better. His genera, his descriptions, his illustrations were all the best of their kind in the world at that time. Those are landmarks. What Linnaeus did that was so important to help with organization, we need pigeonholes. You need an address to put your letters. You need places to store your spices. You need categories to put things in. Linnaeus invented, or at least advanced and perfected, the sexual system of plant identification, where you simply counted the number of stamens that were in the flowers. It turns out he was very lucky. Flower structure gives a major clue as to what plants are. And those flower structures did not vary like leaves or stems or whether the plant was growing in sun or shade. Flowers were quite regular. So he had 24 what he called classes or orders, one stamen, all the plants with 2 stamens, 3 stamens, 4 stamens, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. When he got to 12, he quit counting. And after that, he just lumped all those into many stamens. But then he went on to talk about the ones that were 2 lengths of stamens, the ones where the stamens are on male and female, stamens on male plants, female parts on female plants. So in order to identify things, you simply sat there and counted the stamens and the pistils in the flower, and you knew what class that plant was in. You put it in that pigeonhole. That was a great pastime. So for 100 years, the average person could go out with their botany book, gather some flowers, count the stamens and the pistils, look them up in Linnaeus's book and get the name, and write the name on that specimen, put it in a book of pressed plants. And that was the state of the art for 100 years back then. Simple. Of course, Linnaeus didn't know but 10,000 plants. He had gone up from 6,000 to 10,000, and so he was working with a simpler set of plants to work with. But it still pretty much works today if you wanted to use that. We don't use that anymore. So, for example, here's a lily flower. It's got 6 stamens. So it would be in the class Hexandria. Hex for 6, andria for male stamens. Hexandria. And within that group, you could have 1 pistil, 2 pistils, 3 pistils, however many pistils there were, female parts. And that would put it into that would refine the class a little bit. So that's all you had to do. Here's a flower, unnamed. I mean, I'm not going to tell you the name. It's got lots of stamens, but only 1 pistil. So that's the female pistil that comes up. Those are the stigmas that receive the pollen. So that would go in the class of many stamens, 1 pistil. They did not care about what the flowers looked like, what pollinated them, the size, the shape, when they bloomed, whether they were in the woods or the meadows. They didn't care about all that. Didn't have a way of managing all that data yet. It's just number of stamens, number of pistils, put it in that pigeonhole, and you've got it identified. Here's the rhododendron. 10 stamens and 1 pistil. So 10 stamens is decaandria and monogynia. 10 stamens and 1 pistil. Whereas our native azaleas, which are closely related, in fact, are now considered in the same genus as rhododendron, have only 5 stamens per flower. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know if you count each one of these. 5 there, 5 here. They would have been in a totally different class. They would have been in pentaandria, 5 stamens. So he did not have related plants together all the time, but sometimes he did, because the number of stamens, number of pistils were important part of descriptions of flowers. So sometimes it worked out in relationships, sometimes it didn't. Here's a pea flower, like on a red bud. You look down inside the flower, you pick this flower open, and you count in there are 10 stamens. And you find that 9 of the stamens are fused into a group and 1 stamen is not fused. That put it into a certain class. So people could have fun out picking flowers apart, sitting in a meadow, enjoying the mild weather in the spring. We know tubular flowers, 5 stamens and 1 pistil. That's the same number as the azalea. But does this look like an azalea? No. But it went in the same class. The floral structure is different, the pollinator is different, the way it grew is different, everything about it is different, and yet stamen number automatically, simply put it into the same class with an azalea. That hummingbird doesn't care. Why do we care? Well, we're a little more interested in how things work than hummingbird does. He's just there for a meal, and then he's on to something else. Witch hazel, 4 petals, but that doesn't matter. Count the stamens. Turns out there are 4 stamens too, just by coincidence. 4 stamens and one pistil. So this would go in the tetra group with only 4 stamens, and on and on. And I show you this only because it's interesting. There's Will Stewart, you all know. In late March, I'm going to name a number of places where you can go and see plants if you're so inclined. But in late March, you go down to the Sandhills Sandhills Wildlife Refuge in South Carolina, down near McBee. And if you're clever, you can find this very rare plant called pixie moss. There's a close-up of its flowers. It has 5 stamens and 1 pistil, and these stamens open by little holes in the top of the stamens. That is 5 stamens and 1 pistil. That puts it in the same class as an azalea. Does this look like an azalea? No. It turns out later on we discover it is related to azaleas. So that was quite a coincidence to get it in that same class. It turns out those little holes or pores are important parts of the flower that help determine that particular relationship. What I'm pointing out is that down through the ages, botanists have studied these things. In the early years, it was a little more cruder. In the later years, a little more refined. But that's how they learned things and figured out things. Pixie moss grows, blooms in early spring right alongside of trailing arbutus, which is in the Ericaceae or Heath family. There's the trailing arbutus, one of the first little wildflowers to bloom. It's actually a little shrub. It only grows an inch tall. And these flowers have the same floral structure as an azalea. Doesn't look like an azalea at all. It's the floral structure that gets you into the right category to group things together, but then you have to use other traits to refine that. By 1900 then, Charles Bessey, a botanist, did a fabulous thing. He said, I'm tired of 100 years of this organization of having all these plants named. We've learned how to name them now and give them genus name and species name because of Linnaeus. But we don't know how they fit together into a family tree, so to speak. So Bessey took all the knowledge gained during the 1800s and created what's called Bessey's cactus. Because each of these groups is a group of plants, so he stuck them together in what he thought was their best relationships to each other. When you get through, it looks kind of like a cactus. So here's where our family today, the Ericaceae, would be in this grouping over here on the side. So this was a super major milestone after almost 2,000 years of chaos. This took into account floral structure as well as growth habit, leaf type, how the plant looked in relation to each other, and gave a better knowledge of relationships of plants within families. So now we come to the second part of this program, which you can't even read up there. What is a plant family? So plant families are groupings of similar genera. So like the genera of the Ericaceae, you've got rhododendron, you've got calmia, the mountain laurel, you've got pieris, the andromeda, you've got vaccinium, the blueberries. Those different genera go together in the Ericaceae family because they have similar traits in common. So it's a grouping of similar genera based on floral structure. The family name for the family, as we'll get to, comes from the first name genus that you could put into that family. The family name is always plural. So the Ericaceae that we're talking about today, you would say the Ericaceae are a large family of plants. It's very much like referring to a group of people, tribe of Indians, a category of something. The Catawba Indians lived here in along the Catawba River, Piedmont. It's always plural because you want to recognize the members of that family. Family names always end in ACEAE. That's just a technicality of the way Latin words are made. It was decided upon by a committee of people 200 years ago when they began to make some rules. So you pronounce plant families Acaceae, so Rosaceae. Here's some familiar families you would recognize any day of the week. The rose family, Rosaceae. The magnolia family, Magnoliaceae. The violet family, Violaceae. Geraniaceae. Cucurbitaceae, that's the cucumber. The Asteraceae family, Cactaceae. Amaryllidaceae, Liliaceae. Iridaceae, Orchidaceae. Those are some families that are well known because their signature genus is a well-known ornamental plant to us. There are oodles of families you wouldn't recognize, but these are ones that you do. Some statistics. There are 400 about. I can have it. There are probably some of the vicinity of 437 plant families in the world. So botanists have categorized things into that many. Here in the Carolinas, we have about 200. Not bad. We have a little less than half of the families in the world. There's 13,000 genera in the world. Genera would be again rhododendron, calmia, vaccinium, rosa, iris, lilium. We have 4,000 genera here in the Carolinas. There's 400,000 species of plants in the world. We have about 4,000 species here in the Carolinas. Here's some of the largest families: the mint family, the parsley family, mustard, pea, lily, grass, rose, aster, coffee. You recognize most of these because they have economic uses. A lot of families don't have a particular economic use to us. They may in their local country, but these bigger families definitely are families that are more useful to us. And they're all, these families, remember now, are groups of genera which have groups of species. So some of these have way more than 2,000 species in the family. There's some pretty big families. It's our way of organizing. So I wrote down some economic families that we use for food. The grass family, where all of our grains come from. The bean family, for peas, lentils, beans, and more. The rose family has apples, pears, cherries, plums, and peaches, at the least. Cucumber family, these wonderful things that people sneak into your food. Squash, melons, zucchini, pumpkins. These are very nutritious plants. You should eat more of them, but I don't know if you have to smile. I'll tell you, these are my wife will tell you, these are some of the plants that we think have been a very important part of my diet in the past 2 years. Potato family, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and many more. The mustard family, these wonderful, more wonderful things. Kale, broccoli, cabbage, and turnips. Kale is probably the great saving grace of people who have health problems. Eat more kale. Parsley has many herbs. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. All of those are in the mint family except parsley. Yeah. A lot of things in the mint family. So lots of economic plants. So there are many other families that are used for timber, medicine, super important, spices, ornamentals, rubber, countless useful products. Then there's some families that just exist. We don't yet know what they're good for. So today, this is the third part of the talk, and we're talking about the Ericaceae family, the heath family. This is a very diverse family with hundreds and hundreds of members. Erica, blueberries, azaleas, Ipsisua, Gaultheria, that's the little wintergreen, cranberry, rhododendron. Some of these I don't know. Anyway, this is just a small selection of members of this family. Some of the ones are more familiar than others. We're going to talk about it today because it is diverse and because the Carolinas have more than their share, if you will. They have more than many other places in the Western Hemisphere, really. The Ericaceae family, or the heath family, is named after heath, the genus Erica. Here is a common one. These are very common in Europe and Africa, but not here in America. Ironically, the genus that the family is named after, we don't have any native species here in North America. The Ericas or heaths, but they grow abundant where? Over in northern, on the northern British, Scotland, especially the moors of Scotland and northern England. All of these beautiful hillsides covered with purples, pinks, rose-colored. Those are all little 1 to 2 foot tall heath plants, little members of the genus Erica. And you can't eat them or do much with them, but they're there. Ericas also grow in South Africa. When I was down there 25 years ago, now 30 years ago, I saw lots and lots of Ericas on the hillsides. And they're mostly tubular flowers, usually brightly colored. They're pollinated by counterparts of our hummingbirds. These are sunbirds. They have these long beaks. Some are more curved than others. They're able to pollinate members of the heath of the genus Erica. And I don't know what our hummingbirds would think if we had more of these in this part of the world. The Ericaceae are characterized by their floral structure, which is a tubular flower that's often urceolate. Urceolate is a little tubular flower that's urn-shaped. What is an urn? How does an urn differ from a jar? The mouth is smaller than the body. Okay, so the mouth of this jar, it's not a bottle, it's a jar. It's not a vase, it's an urn. So the mouth of the urn is smaller than the fat body of the urn. That makes it urceolate or urn shape. That's characterized by many, many members of the Ericaceae. There are 5 petals and usually 10 stamens. And the anthers, the male anthers where pollen comes out, open by pores, little holes. The anther doesn't just open and shed pollen. It only opens at the end with little holes. That's unique to this family. Most are evergreen shrubs. There's only one tree that I'm even going to mention today. And most of these live on acid soils. So the family Ericaceae is characterized by a suite of traits. So anywhere in the world you might go, if you want to go look for Ericaceae, you wouldn't go to a sand dune. You wouldn't want to go walk through a rich wildflower forest. You want to go to an acid woods or a high mountain open heath, bald or bog, somewhere where the soil is acid and sunny and moist all the time. So they have a kind of a trend there. Now the Ericaceae are, notice, Ericaceae are divided into 3 separate subfamilies or 3 separate groups. I'm going to quickly go through these. The first group are the non-green parasitic ones that we know around here as the Indian ghost pipes. These come in white, pink, and red. Then there's the small evergreen plants with rosettes of leaves. You've all seen Pipsissewa, which we call the spotted wintergreen or Pipsissewa. And then there's the third and largest group, more traditional Ericaceae, which are the rhododendrons, azaleas, mountain laurel, and blueberries that have urceolate petals, corollas, formed into an urn. Just a few pictures of the parasitic ones because they're so interesting. They're non-green. They don't have any chlorophyll at all. They're parasitic on the roots of various trees out in the forest. Here's some that are red. If you open one of these flowers, you'll find perfect urn-shaped flower. That's one flower. It's got stamens, 10 stamens that open by pores. These are pollinated by bumblebees in the woods. There's this fascinating one. I mentioned this to you only because you should be out looking for this in the early spring. It's the purple ghost pipes, or the sweet pine sap, pygmy pipes, purple Indian pipes. These grow up in rhododendron thickets. If you go to the mountains and walk along trails, they'll smell a sweet fragrance in early spring, wherever you happen to be. You'll walk along until you find these little 2, 3, 4 inch plants coming up in the trail. You'll find them with your nose before you see them with your eyes. You should be looking for those pygmy pipes. They're found only here in the southern Appalachians. But out west, there are other genera of these parasitic, non-green members of the Ericaceae. There's this one called the candy stripe plant. This one's called the snow plant. It comes up in the snow. This one is called pine sap. That one's called the gnome flower. Notice there's no green parts, no green leaves. They're all parasites. What makes them all go together? Floral structure. They have urceolate flowers inside 10 stamens that open by pores. No matter what else they look like, the telltale sign of the floral structure gives them away. Quick question?
Yeah, real quick. Nowadays with DNA and genetics, do we know if any of these families are actually truly related?
Great question. That's the 21st century. We do know. This has been studied. There have been people who have been wanting to separate these off into other families, and all of the genetic and fancy DNA studies have shown that they're perfectly good in the Ericaceae family. So now some botanists split them off anyway. That's fine too. We don't listen to them. So here's your, and then there's the second of these small groups, the dwarf wintergreen subfamily. This has things like the spotted or the striped Pipsissoa that you see in dry woods around here. It has 10 stamens. There's its 5 petals, and each of these stamens opens by a little pore. I don't know if you can see those pores there. Each of the 10 stamens. So the insects that visit these have to be able to get that pollen out of those stamens. Pollen's just not sitting in there. Pollen is like Bitcoin. You have to almost apply for it in order to get some because it's so precious. So they only want to give it away to the right kinds of insects. We'll see what those right kinds of insects are. Here's the one you would see in North Carolina. About a dozen of these up north. We have this one, the round-leaved wintergreen, here in the mountains of North Carolina. These are the kind of little plants that would have been put in earlier days, maybe even now. Tell me if you've seen one of these lately. These little brandy sniffer type of terrariums she bought, and it would have a spotted wintergreen, a partridge berry with its red berries, club moss, a rattlesnake orchid, maybe 1 or 2 other little miniature evergreen woodland plants that would all go into this little woodland terrarium, so to speak. None of these plants live very long in there. It might live 6 months, might stay alive for 6 months, but they're not going to grow in that brandy sniffer. It seems like a good idea to some people at the time, I suppose. Now, the more traditional Ericaceae, the larger group of Ericaceae with dozens of genera around the world and hundreds of species around the world, mountain laurels, and this is our May white azalea, which is our most recently identified azalea. It grows only in South Carolina. Blooms in May, white flowers. It's not a very good picture. I think the picture was exposed for the butterfly. The flowers sort of all turned white, but it has a yellow blotch. Very, very fragrant in May, which is not a time when any other azaleas are in bloom. I just mentioned that. I want to mention a few of our more famous Carolina, or certainly Eastern North America members of the Ericaceae to give you a feeling for this family. Remember, this is the sourwood is the only tree in the whole family in our part of the world. All the rest are shrubs. They're mostly evergreen, but not all. Thick leaves that have tiny teeth at best, but not all. They have urceolate flowers, but not all. So there are a few exceptions, but the rules still hold for the vast majority of the species. So our sourwood tree, which is so prominent up in the mountains, even here in the Piedmont, is a wonderful species. It blooms in early summer with these little white flowers, turns a great fall color. Here's where it's known. It's only known from this area. There's only one species. It's monotypic. The name up there you can't read, Oxydendrum arboreum, which means sourwood tree. Oxy, sour, dendrum, wood, arboreum, tree, sourwood tree. What's it good for? Sourwood honey. This is the same price per quart as other great honeys like Tupelo honey, which is very rare, and maple syrup, which is very rare, getting rarer. So here's a tree, very famous. As far as the world goes, very narrow range. So we're lucky to have it here, and probably in every single county, even though some of the counties don't have. The light green colors means it's been found and documented to be in those counties. The further north you go, the less you see it. Now, this is the world distribution of rhododendron. Rhododendron, very big family for us. We love rhododendrons. Beautiful shrubs, ornamentals. You can't eat them. You can only grow them for beauty. Rhododendrons and azaleas are in the same genus. So here's the world distribution of rhododendrons, all along the west coast into whatever that is, Alaska, around these far northern members are little low shrubs you could never grow here. You can go up there and look at them, but you can't grow them down here. But here in the east, we have quite a few members of the family from north to south and as far west as was pretty high rainfall. And, some things in Europe, and then China, Japan, and the Far East is another stronghold for rhododendrons. In fact, there are more rhododendrons in the Himalayas than all the rest of the world put together. If you want to go see rhododendrons, you have to hike up 10,000 feet in the Himalayas near Mount Everest to see fabulous rhododendrons. Notice rhododendrons are not tropical. Hardly any. This is the most tropical over here in Asia. You get some very famous rhododendrons that are tropical. And these you grow as houseplants in the greenhouse. The vast majority of rhododendrons, as well as the other Ericaceae, are temperate, not tropical. So rhododendrons, we recognize here in North Carolina, we have 3 species of wild rhododendrons. The big white one you see up in the mountains, the famous Catawba rhododendron up in the mountains. Then there's the little small flower. Here it is, rhododendron minus, the small flower rhododendron. This might look big, but this is no bigger than the palm of your hand, whereas those other big ones are big as your whole hand. Then there's a famous rare one, rhododendron Chapmanii. Comes from 6 counties in northern Florida. It's an endangered species. This leftover, it's related to this one. These are, we believe, are left over when the glaciers came down and pushed all the plants to the south. This azalea just moved right on south along with everybody else. And then when the glaciers left 10,000 years ago, plants moved back to the north and left these few isolated pockets of this rhododendron down there. And it's heavily impacted by what else but development. There are many rhododendrons that have been hybridized to use in gardens. You only need to visit the Van Landingham Glen or UNCC in the spring to see how big some of these rhododendrons can be. These are all hybrids. They come in every conceivable color, although yellow is rare. You'll see this when we go to a rhododendron flower show. It's nothing more beautiful than an array of rhododendrons in bloom, because they come in practically every color. It's hard to find a good blue one, it's hard to find a good yellow one, but all the shades of pinks and whites and creams and other colors, purples, beautiful. So we grow these for ornament. And within rhododendron, there are also the azaleas. The azaleas are separate groups. The evergreen azaleas that come from Japan have only 10 stamens, like rhododendrons. The deciduous azaleas have 5 stamens, which is different. Now, as a botanist, this is everyday knowledge for us botanists. We sit around and talk about this. It's hard to explain to average knowledgeable people why one group of azaleas has 10 stamens and another group has 5 stamens. And that would take more than a minute and 40 seconds, so I'm not going to try to do that. But you need to know that there are these vast array of evergreen azaleas that we grow in front of our homes and out in the yard. Some have giant flowers, some have smaller flowers, some grow in pots. You buy them as gift plants. These are your evergreen azaleas. They all come from Japan and China. They're relatives in China. Here's what most people do to them. They plant them, then they prune them into squares. There's a really square one. So they prune them so they prune off half the flowers. So if you're going to grow azaleas like this, at least don't prune them until after they bloom. Let them bloom, then go out and prune them into a little square or round or whatever. They're a lot better plants to prune into geometric shapes than azaleas. And then on the other hand, there are native azaleas that have 5 stamens in each flower. We have 16 species in the south, in the east, more than anywhere else in the world of our deciduous azaleas. Things like flame azalea, the Oconee azalea, Piedmont azalea. There's just a wealth of azaleas. You can't drive 2 miles in any direction in the east and not find yourself a stream or woods or mountain where you can find at least one species of native azalea. So they're everywhere. They go from the mountains to the coast. My favorite is the pink shell azalea. It's endemic to the North Carolina mountains. In other words, it's only found in about 7 counties in the mountains of North Carolina. And they bloom in early spring. If you want to see a fabulous display, May 10th, drive up south of Asheville on the Blueberries Parkway to Black Balsam. I don't think that east goes to be there. Black Balsam, you'll find it on a map. And the woods will be pink, white. It's covered. The understory layer will be the pink shell azalea. I found nowhere else in the world. They're not easy to grow here in the Piedmont as it's gotten warmer, but they're worth going up there to look at. I just happen to have these excellent pictures. Remember that the pollen in all these plants comes out through pores. The ends of the pollen. So look at the pollen just dripping in the pores there. I would say this veil is quite eager to do something with that pollen. This is a mess over here, but that's pollen. And here's the pollen that I got on my fingers here on purpose to show you that the pollen comes out through the pores. It comes out in strings. So one bee that goes there at the right time and wallows around that flower is going to pull all the pollen out because they're like beads. They'll get all that pollen on their body before they leave. Why does the bee go to these flowers? For the pollen. This is like shopping at Harris Teeter. This is meat. This is meat cheese for bees. And the nectar is like fuel. Fly. So this is what they eat. Mountain laurel, we're all familiar with mountain laurel, but we ever looked at one really closely. A native mountain laurel that occurs quite widespread throughout the region, even added to the coastal plain. Then there's the little sheep-kill laurel, a little dwarfling that occurs in the mountains and the coast, but not here in the Piedmont. What's unique about these is they have 10 stamens, and the stamens fit into little pouches. Nothing else quite like that in the world. There's no mountain laurel anywhere else in the world. In that mountain laurel flower, those stamens are bent over like an old-fashioned mousetrap. The stamen, the anther where the pollen is hooked down in that little pouch. So as the bumblebee, as she walks around in the flower getting nectar, she trips over those stamens. The stamens spring up like a mousetrap, and out of the holes in the stamens, she's dusted with a little dollop of pollen. It's sort of like trying to eat with your eyes closed, and you get a spoonful of mashed potatoes that go whoop. Sometimes it hits your mouth, and sometimes it hits your eyes, and sometimes it goes over your head. So start noticing mountain laurels now. Take your children, grandchildren, neighborhood kids, whoever you can find, out to show the mountain laurel in the spring, and have them with a toothpick or a pine needle trip those stamens. It's quite a trip. Leucothoe or dog hobble. This is pronounced leucothoe. That's kind of a diphthong. It's not leucotho or leucothoe. It's leucothoe. So try to do that. Dog hobble. These are evergreen shrubs in the mountains. Got a big one up here. In the spring, the flowers hang down below. Notice the flowers are all little urceolate corollas, just like a little lily of the valley. In fact, the sourwood tree is sometimes called the lily of the valley tree. The bees just love this. So these flowers make a really high quality nectar for bees, but the bees have a hard time getting into it. They have to have a long enough tongue, as I'll show you in a minute, and they got to be able to get that pollen. And that keeps the pollen safe from casual visitors. It only lets in the pollinators that this flower chooses. We don't know yet. It's been hard to translate bee language, find out why they like this so much, but someday we may know. Here's some of these. This one blooms before the leaves come out. You can see the little Ursulate. These are abundant up in the mountains, the high mountains. We love to go up and see these in the spring. Here's one that grows down here in Piedmont. You could grow in your yard, but it's not very ornamental. It's interesting, but it's not ornamental enough to have right in the front yard. They need to know about it. The Andromedas, the genus Pieris. By the way, Andromeda is a common name that's been used since time immemorial. I'm not quite sure what it refers to. It's used a lot in the Ericaceae. This is our native Pieris floribunda, called the mountain fetterbush. It grows only on high elevations. Here again, up around black balsam. And here's this Japanese counterpart, which I have one up front. It's already started blooming this year. The strangest of all members of the Ericaceae grows here from South Carolina on down to the Gulf Coast. It's called climbing fetterbush, Pieris filariifolia. Here it is in bloom. I got a piece up here in bloom. The way you go to see them is you go down to the Gulf Coast or the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia, and you wade out into the water, and you find pond cypress trees. Not all cypress, but pond cypress. And then you look up at the tree, if you're in the right place, you'll find these strange branches growing out of the side of the cypress tree. And you say, well, that's not a cypress branch. And all cypress don't have little white flowers. Then you realize that this Pieris is growing in the ground around the base of the cypress, and it grows up underneath the thin bark of the cypress tree. When it reaches 10, 20, 30 feet high, it sends out branches and blooms. So it's a way of being a tree, but not being a tree. So you're a shrub and you want to be a tree, and you can't be a vine. So you do it this way. As far as I know, this is unique in all the world to have this sub-bark growing plant that would normally be growing in the dirt or the ground, decide to grow up the inside of the tree. It's fascinating. And out in the Glen at the university, this is one of the plants that has survived out there with the least maintenance for 50 years. Audrey and I were out there looking at it yesterday. I picked a little piece, growing in the shade, and there it gets watered. It's sitting there blooming, and it's not a showstopper, but it's there. One of the problems is with growing Ericaceae here in this region is our city water. City water pH used to be 8. Now I'm told it's up to 9. I haven't checked it. These plants do not like alkaline water. They would rather their water be down in pH of 5 to 6.5. That's what they like. And as you have to water them more with city water, they like it less. So they just decide to leave. And they die. Going to where the water is better. That's a real problem with growing some of these in this region. I've been growing this plant at home for 50 years. It's Zenobia, ancient Greek name called honeycups. White ursulate flowers hang down. They're beautiful in the spring. They have a whitish leaf that turns a beautiful fall color, etc. So here's a plant that could be grown more, should be grown more. It's not available commercially. It doesn't grow fast enough for nurserymen to sell it. You occasionally get them at university plant sales and other odd places. So you have to be on the lookout for them. Zenobia. Here's wintergreen. These are the leaves. If you chew on the leaves, you get the wintergreen smell. I have one of these up here you can smell. Here it is growing up in the high mountains along with Galax, trailing arbutus, and other little shrubs. One of the great places you ought to go, it should be on your bucket list. I don't have a bucket list anymore. I have a teacup list. So I've kind of gone to all the places I can, big time places I go. The Flat Rock Trail up on the Blue Ridge Parkway near Grandfather Mountain. You can find it on the map, or you can Google it. It's an excellent 20-minute walk. You'll see more Ericaceae up there than any other single place I know that you can easily get to. Rhododendrons, all of our native rhododendrons, mountain laurel, Eucalyptus, blueberries, you name it. There's galax and the little wintergreen with its berries, and trailing arbutus, all kinds of. So it's a very acid place for these kinds of plants. A wonderful place to go. I've seen people hike this in flip-flops, so I know that you can do it with your regular shoes. So if you ever need a good outing, it's a one-day trip. I mean, you can do this all in one day. Drive up there, walk around. Don't fall off. Don't go in the rain. Don't go in the snow. Flat Rock Trail. I used to take, for 40 years, I took classes there to see plants. Finally, we get to the greatest of all members of the blueberry family, and that's the blueberries. The vaccinium. The blueberries are such an important food. Antioxidants. Eat a handful of blueberries a day. Here's a typical blueberry with its Urceolae corolla. And this is a blueberry bee. We actually have native bees that specialize on blueberries. And if you look down and cut the flower in half, and you'll see the stamens in here. And in the ends of each of the stamens are two pores. So those are where the pollen is to come from. So the two things about the bumblebees that eat vacciniums. They have a long enough tongue so they cannot crawl into the flower. The hole's too small. So they have to have a long tongue to reach the nectar, and they have to be able to get the pollen out. And how do they do that? They vibrate it out. They buzz. This is what you've heard me talk about buzz pollination before. You hear bees go. She's trying to find the frequency, vibrating her wings, to suck the pollen out of these stamens through their pores. And when she finds that frequency, she'll get all the pollen she can out of each flower. So you'll hear the buzzing, and they're pollinating these kinds of flowers that they can't get into. That's important. We used to think they might have been conversing with one another, but they're not. What if you had to do that in the grocery store? You walk up to the seafood counter. I like those shrimp. You suck out a few shrimp, put them in a bag. That's what the bees are doing. They're having to suck their food out of these little tubes. That's as good a way as any to keep the pollen clean, keep it in there. And of course, they lead to wonderful fruits. Our rabbit-eye blueberry, there's not a rabbit-eye blueberry. The blueberries we eat for food are a group of blueberries called the rabbit-eye blueberries. They were developed decades ago from hybridizing our native blueberries in different parts of the country. So up north, colder, tolerant blueberries, and deep south, like northern Florida, warmer. In fact, the blueberries you get in the grocery stores now are from North Florida, the northeast corner of Florida. And then they'll work their way up and down the coast. You get all kind of wonderful blueberries. The last thing here is our native cranberry, which is found nowhere else in the world. In fact, blueberries are only found in North America. Blueberries and cranberry. Here's a typical cranberry flower. You can see the stamens, the little pores right there. These are the cranberries that come along after the flowers pollinate. This is a picture, some of you may have been with me. This is the smallest cranberry bog in North America, and it's the southernmost cranberry bog. You're seeing the whole cranberry bog right there. You could park your Cadillac on top of that bog. It's up in the Black Balsam region. Hike out to it about 20 minutes. So all this little green leafy stuff all in here are the cranberry leaves. And there are a few other things growing in there, but it's mostly cranberries. And there's some orchids and other things that grow in there. People love to go there to see this little miniature garden.
I thought they had cranberry bogs up in the Northeast.
Well, we do, but not down here. This is the southernmost one. It's too hot down here for cranberries. So just like this is a commercial cranberry bog up in, this could be in New Jersey, it could be in Massachusetts. This particular one is in Massachusetts. You grow cranberries commercially, zone 6 and north of here, not in the Carolinas. The closest you can see some really good cranberries will be up in West Virginia, what's called the cranberry glades. That's another good place to go for a vacation. So you walk out through these vast acreages of cranberry bog. They're peat bogs, carpeted with cranberry and other ericaceous plants and other ferns, and there's poison sumac, it says. You find all of those there. Pitcher plants grow in these cranberry bogs. And there's no question that, since I have a picture, if you go up north, this is a cranberry bog. It's a lake filling in with peat, and cranberries grow all around the edges. These are not commercially, you gotta have an easier place to get in commercially, so you create places for cranberries up in the, not at far north, but a little further south. So wherever you go, we come back full circle, whether you're in a northern cranberry bog or in southern pitcher plant bog or high in the mountains, rocky outcrops. You got habitat for Ericaceae. Cold, it tends to be cold, moist, acid, sunny. The plants are usually shrubs, and there's a typical scenario there for members of the Ericaceae family. So here's the kind of habitats we mostly see today. Cultivated blueberry habitat, rows and rows of high bush blueberries, where you can pick them by the gallon. And there's the plants. If you grow them at home, that's great. Get one that's local for this climate. You can grow your own cranberries. So there's a quick view of the Ericaceae family and all of its diversity, from the trees to the ground cover, the shrubs in between, the edible, the not so edible, the ornamental, etc. So I hope that gives you a good feeling for Ericaceae. That's it.
Not bad. Where do huckleberries fit into the blueberry book?
Huckleberries are right next to blueberries. They're similar.
Yeah.
And the difference is they're two different. They look alike in some cases. Huckleberries have little golden dots on the underside of their leaves. You can see where the hand lands. And they only have 10 seeds.
Yeah.
Well, the fruits can be just as big as a.
I grew up with them.
They're usually a little smaller.
Yeah.
Not as juicy, not as tasty. Can be good, but that's the difference. The main difference is the huckleberry fruits have only 10 seeds.
Huh.
And blueberries have 20 little tiny seeds.
Huh.
They're same habitat. Other questions?
So I never tried to.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother. It's very hot down here, and our city water is not conducive. But over in the Van Landingham Glen at UNCC, 20 years ago, we had 4,000 rhododendrons, azaleas, mountain laurel, just all of those things growing there beautifully. Then the weather got warmer, summers got hotter, the nights got hotter, city water changed, and now we have only 400, not 4,000. So you can grow them here. I've seen some beautiful ones, but mostly I watched them disappear down through the ages in people's yards. So it used to be a beautiful rhododendron, slowly dies back as it gets hotter. People try to water them more.
And then what if you collected rainwater? Would that make a difference?
That certainly make a difference. It won't make it cooler, but it'll help. It'll help with the pH.
Yeah.
If they like acidity and the other stuff don't really,
They'll sort themselves out.
Okay.
I find that native azaleas are much more forgiving than rhododendrons. So I've turned all of our. We used to have 150 rhododendron azaleas in our small home garden. All the rhodos have died, and I've replaced them with native azaleas, and they're flourishing.
And is blueberries as forgiving or not?
No, blueberries are not as forgiving. You have got to have acid soil. I planted some blueberries over historic Rosedale, and I could not make them grow for 5 years, and I finally went out and stomped them down. I watered them, I fertilized them, I acidified them, I did everything I could do, and I just didn't have the complete. It's more complicated than that, but this didn't work out at that site. And yet I've seen people with beautiful blueberries in my own neighborhood in their backyard, whereas we can't grow them at our house because our soil's not acid enough.
If you had to pick just one native azalea to plant, pine, oak, place for.
Well, I'd choose our native Piedmont azalea, for sure. They're adapted for that exact situation. They grow along eroded stream banks here in the Piedmont. You can get them out into a little more sun. You don't put them in the dense, dark forest. Put them on the edge or remove some trees. But the Piedmont azalea, which is usually in the pink to white range, very fragrant, would be the one. I would not get flame azaleas from the mountains. Pinkster is one. You've got Pinkster and Piedmont are both very similar. So either of those are found here in the Piedmont. Pinkster is both bloom around Easter time, mid-April, depending on the year. So those are the ones that I would say would be more foolproof. But I grow.
That's what
I grow dozens of tomatoes. We grow hundreds over the first, and they all do pretty good.
We have a couple questions online.
Okay.
One was, why is it so difficult to propagate blueberries, for example?
They're not difficult at all. They root readily.
No.
The blueberry industry is just booming. We sell dozens and dozens of blueberry plants every year at our plant sales.
So what's the best technique that you think of to propagate?
Take the cuttings just after flowering in the early summer, just as the new growth begins to harden. Take cuttings then if you want to propagate them from cuttings. Then grow from seeds. Now you won't, if you grow from seed, you won't get the same name variety that you thought you might get. So it's better to buy them commercially propagated. Get young ones for a few dollars. The bigger they get, the more you pay, the sooner you get blueberries. They'll root from cuttings. I've never bothered to root cuttings. I mean, I may have just for fun, see if I can do it. But I don't root them routinely. Questions? More questions? If you have questions, you can ask me individually. Well, I hope you enjoyed that romp through the Ericaceae.
Yes, thank you.